the mic working?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a clicker? No? Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Madeline Ryder. I'm a student here at the University of Arizona studying conservation biology, geography, and French. I'm going to talk to you today about an exploratory study that I'm doing with the SRI program here in the summer of 2013. The title of my research study is Visions in the Desert, an exploratory study on the Santa Cruz, its health, and what we should or shouldn't do about it. So just to recap from my previous presentations, my research questions are: how do people perceive the health of the Santa Cruz River? Why? And what does that mean for management of the river? And although I didn't mention this before, I have a little bit of natural history about the Santa Cruz. It used to run perennially, meaning year-round, until about 80 years ago when it became desiccated, and it was also channelized because of major floods in the 1980s. So all of this was happening amidst development of Tucson as a city, and along with that, with the sinking of the water table, came a large die-off of the riparian area and a lot of the cottonwoods and willows and mesquite trees that used to live along the river. So my major claims are that there are a spectrum of perceptions of what the health of the river is, as opposed to just a single one that is unanimous and true. I also, although I didn't state this earlier, I've been developing a new idea, and I call it psycho-ecological co-restoration. I called it restoration in my previous presentation, but I just didn't have a way of describing what it was that I was actually thinking about. So this is a really fancy term that you can use, or I'm just working with. And basically, I have another inherent claim that I can't test in this study because there just isn't enough time or money or ways for me to do it yet. But I believe that the acknowledgement and inclusions of these multiple perceptions of a particular environment are foundational to what I call psycho-ecological co-restoration, which is restoring not only an ecosystem, but how we interact with it and how we interact with other people and the different ways that we all interact with it. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, cool. But just to be clear, this isn't going to be addressed in this study because I don't have enough time. So my methodology, there are 5 main stages for data processing that I used in this study: collection, disassembly, comparison, reassembly, and analysis. For collection, I tried to get multiple fields, which is like occurrences of data collection, multiple formats, written, oral, things like that, and multiple sources, i.e. like individual people. I tried to get as many as possible and as much variety as possible. And that was in order to triangulate, which is the second bullet point there, which is to seek confirmation from 3 sources, or more than 3 sources, as well as from 3 different kinds of sources, which comes from a book titled Qualitative Research from Start to Finish that I've been reading to try and figure out how to do qualitative research. So basically with triangulation, I was trying to look for particular responses in multiple formats, as you can see above, including a long interview, several short interviews. There are about 30 of the short interviews, email surveys, and verbatim transcripts from the city and county governments on wastewater treatment. I should note that I had control over what I wanted to ask in the first 3, but in the last one, I sort of had to choose what I could from what they were saying because it was something that had already occurred, and I'm just trying to sort of suss out some perceptions that the people in those transcripts had. So next was disassembly and comparison. Basically, I have my main research question, like I said, perception of the health of the Santa Cruz. I wanted to separate direct responses to that question from like demographic, experiential, like people's experiences with the river, and managerial responses, what people think should be done to the river. Because I wanted to reduce bias towards acquaintances, because I knew some of the people who had made responses, especially in the email surveys, and I wanted to separate out their answers to a point where I could recognize who was answering. And I also wanted to focus specifically on those direct responses to keep from conflating other responses and saying, well, they said it in this other question or this other response, so they must have meant it here. So I didn't want to do that. From there, I basically took those responses to their perceptions of the health of the Santa Cruz and tried to, over many hours, form some sort of, or try to suss out some patterns and some trends. And I came up with categories, or just, you could think of them as frames of thought. And a good example is the time frame that people used. They could use a historical time frame. Well, you know, it was a great river back in the day when I was a child. Or contemporary, it sucks now. Or futuristic, you know, it's going to be better. Or none of us are going to be here in 100 years, so it doesn't even matter. Or holistic, which is all three of those. You know, it used to run, now it doesn't, but I think there can be a lot of potential for the future. And the asterisks next to historical and futuristic mean that nobody actually gave those answers only. Like, nobody only stayed in a historical perspective, and nobody only stayed in a futuristic perspective. And although there were no answers in those particular subcategories, the point was to not only see what was there, but what wasn't there. Like, what were people not saying? So I tried to include, you know, sort of all possible answers in a category, regardless of whether people actually gave answers for that. So, and then after that, I reassembled the responses that, because there were multiple categories beyond just time frames, I tried to reassemble them according to how identical they were, or, you know, if similar answers were both, you know, historical and water was the dominant characteristic, and they, you know, blamed recreationalists, or, you know, things like that. And I tried to group those into specific stances. And I should mention that the stances aren't all encompassing, and because it's not a representative sample of Tucsonans, it was a very opportunistic sample because of the limited amount of time that I had. I couldn't go out and pay people to talk to me. I couldn't, you know, spend days and days out trying to find people. So it was very opportunistic, and I'm not saying that this is representative of everyone. So after that, I brought in the demographic, experiential, and managerial responses, and to try and suss out answers to those other two questions of why they perceive what they perceive, and what does that mean for management of the river. And those I did by trying to explain through the particular responses to those questions. Unfortunately, this is the most subjective stage of data processing, because people can't generally answer specifically why they think a certain way. So I have to try and come up with a reason for it. And also, a lot of the times people didn't know what was being done to the river, so they couldn't say, well, management should do this and this and this and this. They just said, well, I think there should be more water in it. And I would have to try and say, well, what does that mean for management? So I had to make a couple leaps and bounds. Well, not bounds, hopefully just little hops. So, yeah. And right now, I don't have...
You're already at 9 minutes.
9 minutes, okay. So I don't have results right now, but the main concluding thought that I have is that there is a spectrum emerging, so I feel like my claim is already being supported. And like I said before, I had many restrictions for this study, so I would need to flesh it out for another study. These are my acknowledgements. It's my email if you have any questions. Thank you. Should we do questions or just keep going?